A great deal of the philosophy that's going on today in the English-speaking world, in fact probably most of it, can be traced back through intermediate developments to the work of two men, Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell. Working for the most part independently of each other, they laid the foundations of modern logic. But more than that, although the work on which they began concerned chiefly the principles of mathematics and the relationship between mathematics and logic, its implications went so wide that in the course of time it came to have a profound influence on philosophy in general. Exactly the same happened with the philosopher who most obviously and directly followed on from them, namely Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein started by developing Russell's and Frege's work in mathematical logic, but he ended up acquiring an influence at large on 20th century philosophy which is second to nobody's. In this programme, without going into any of the technicalities of mathematics or logic, I want to give some indication of how Frege and Russell came to have this enormous influence on 20th century thought, and to say a little about some of the more recent individuals and groups who've come under that influence. But first, a word about the individuals themselves. Frege, a German, was born in 1848 and spent his entire working life in comparative obscurity in the mathematics department of the University of Jena. Not until after his death did his name become known at all widely, even among philosophers. His first major work, published in 1879, was called Begriffsschrift, and I'm afraid even the English translation keeps the German title because there's no satisfactory English for it. It means something like the putting of concepts into notation, and we'll begin to see later what that's about. His next major work, published in 1884, is called in English The Foundations of Arithmetic. He went on producing important and original work, most notably in 1893 and 1903, 2 volumes of a projected larger work called in English The Basic Laws of Arithmetic. But it was all of such depth and difficulty that his work in general remained very largely unknown until Bertrand Russell drew attention to it in 1903. Russell was a totally different sort of person, grandson of a British Prime Minister, from whom he was later, via his elder brother, to inherit an earldom. He was always prominent on the political and social scene as well as in philosophy, in fact a famous public figure all his life. He did a tremendous amount of popular writing and journalism and broadcasting, which influenced social attitudes among successive generations of British people. I think this has obscured for many the fact that the true foundations of his fame as a philosopher lie in contributions to mathematical logic of a highly professional and technical character. He was born in 1872 and lived till 1970, and was politically active almost to the end, though the great bulk of his philosophical work was done by the 1920s. Here to discuss the work of these two men and some of its influences down to our own day is one of the most famous philosophers of our time, Ayer, who has written a great deal about Russell, including the best short introductory book on Russell's work. Professor Ayer, let's start with Frege as being the earlier figure. When he began, what was it he was trying to do?
Well, he was trying to make up what he thought were deficiencies in arithmetic. He thought that mathematical statements, as they were expressed in his day, were not sufficiently precise, and that mathematical proofs were not sufficiently rigorous. And so he began by trying to develop a notation, the Begriffsschrift you referred to, in which this would be remedied. And the notation was to show exactly what mathematical statements stated and exactly what their proofs consisted in. It was supposed to make it obvious how one step in a proof succeeded another. And this was a deficiency in mathematics in his time, applying even to Euclid, where there were assumptions not made explicit which were required for the proofs to be valid.
Wasn't one of the points involved that every argument, including a mathematical proof, has to have premises, and what those premises are often creates problems, and he tried to show that all mathematics was ultimately derived from pure principles of logic.
Exactly. Both he and Russell did this, and this involved 2 enterprises. First of all, defining mathematical concepts in purely logical one, and secondly showing that mathematics, arithmetic anyhow, not all mathematics, but arithmetic was deducible from purely logical premises. And this was achieved, the first part was achieved fairly simply. I think a fairly simple illustration will show how it was done. If you take, let's say, any couple, let's take Tom and Jerry, then you can define them as a couple by saying that they are both members of the set, and anything which is a member of the set is identical with one or other of them. Then you define the number 2 as a set of such sets, as a set of couples. And you do this for all numbers. And there are certain complications about infinity, but in this way you can define a cardinal number in purely logical terms, which is what he did. And then also, by generalizing logic, which hadn't hitherto been done, Aristotelian logic, which had prevailed from ancient times until the 19th century, was not wholly general. He was able to state premises from which most arithmetic was deducible. It was shown later by somebody, by another logician, the Austrian Gödel, that in fact this couldn't be completely done, that arithmetic couldn't be completed, but that insofar as it could be completed, Frege showed a method of doing it.
Wouldn't it also be true to say that before Frege, the laws of logic had been regarded as laws of thought, that's to say, as something to do with human mental processes, but Frege realized that this couldn't be so, that the validity of a proof couldn't depend on our psychology.
Oh yes, this was very important. This was one of the most important things that Frege did, and he began by one of his early works was an attack on a book on arithmetic by a German philosopher called Husserl, in which logic was represented as a theory of judgment, and it was how it was viewed by the German idealists, and Frege insisted it was entirely objective, had nothing to do with psychological processes, but that the sets in which you reduced numbers were entirely objective things, and that logic was quite independent wasn't about psychology at all. These were objective truths, which of course the mind was capable of grasping. They didn't depend upon features of thinking.
Yeah. So the search then becomes, in a mathematical proof, for what it is that the proof conveys from step to step.
That's right.
That impersonally validates the conclusion,
That's perfectly right.
regardless of how we think.
And this, in a way, accounts for Frege having a philosophical interest beyond his purely mathematical work, because he also developed a theory of meaning, a theory of meaning which would show how mathematics could be objectively valid. And he talked of the he tied up the meaning of mathematical statements, but this could be extended to statements in general, with truth conditions, with the features in them that made them candidates for truth or falsehood.
I suppose the most historically influential distinction that he introduced was the distinction between sense and reference, which has to do with his theory of meaning, and one still hears people constantly referring to this. Can you explain it?
Yes, it's fairly complicated. The two German expressions are Sinn, which is generally translated sense, and Bedeutung, which is translated, well, it is in fact the German word for meaning, but is by philosophers usually translated as either reference or denotation. And the denotation of a name is the object to which it names. I mean, the denotation of Bryan Magee is you, the actual person.
Yes.
Whereas the sense of the name is the contribution that it makes to the meaning. And say, if I just say Tom, you have to say to me, who's Tom? And then I say, well, Tom is so-and-so's brother, or the person who invented such and such, or the first person that climbed a mountain. And in this way I give you a sense, and in this way I enable you to identify him. Now, this distinction becomes important in certain contexts. Generally, what you care about in the case of a name is what the name stands for. But there are certain cases where it's important to make a distinction between sense and denotation. And one good example would be statements of identity. Frege's own favorite example was that of the evening star and the morning star, both of which, as you know, are
in fact,
Venus.
the same star.
Same
Yes.
star, Venus.
Yes.
But if someone says the evening star is identical with the morning star, and one takes the reference of these two expressions to be the denotation, then he's simply saying Venus is Venus, which is a tautology and of no interest, whereas in fact the morning star and the evening star is a mathematical discovery. And therefore, in this usage, what the expressions refer to is not their denotation, not the object, but their senses.
So in other words, he analysed meaning into two different components.
That's right.
Sense and reference.
Yes.
And a statement may have a sense, but not have a reference.
Well, it happens in two ways, and there could be names or nominal expressions, like present King of France, for example, which has a sense but no reference because nobody corresponds to it. And also there is the complicated case of expressions which have a function in a sentence as contributing to its making it capable of being true or false, but don't denote anything, like predicates. Is good, is bad, is so on and so on, which themselves are what he called incomplete expressions, namely don't themselves have a reference but contribute to giving the sentence a sense, and through its sense a reference.
And these distinctions that he introduced and his theory of meaning have in fact had a very widespread influence in philosophy, haven't they?
They've become very fashionable in recent years, that's to say, and there's been a change in anyhow in England, and perhaps well, England and the United States to some extent, and a change in sort of main concern of philosophy. For a very, very long time, the theory of knowledge was dominant. Ever since Descartes in his successors in the 17th century, the main concern has been the theory of knowledge, what we can know and how we can know it and how we are justified in holding the beliefs we do. And in recent years, this has given way to what's sometimes called the philosophy of logic, which is mainly concerned with questions about meaning, and here Frege has come into great prominence. And for instance, my successor as Professor of Logic at Oxford, Michael Dummett, has devoted nearly, certainly two large books to Frege's work, and is concerned with exploring the implications of Frege's distinctions for a theory of meaning.
Well, Michael Dummett, who I suppose must be called the leading living commentator on Frege, makes enormously large claims for him, doesn't he? He says that he's introduced a whole new era in philosophy, that he has de-psychologized philosophy, that in the way you just explained, he dethroned the theory of knowledge from the center of philosophy and replaced it with logic. And this has changed 300 years of philosophical development.
Well, I think there has been a difference of emphasis, but I think that Michael exaggerates in two ways. First of all, philosophers have always been concerned with meaning ever since Socrates, who went about saying what is knowledge, what is goodness, and so on, which is a way of asking what the Greek equivalents of these terms meant. So there's always been an interest in meaning in philosophy. And secondly, I don't think interest in the theory of knowledge has totally disappeared. I think that there are still people who are connected with concerned with this. And insofar as even in Michael Dummett's own work, the theory of meaning is very much bound up with questions about truth and falsehood, this also doesn't entirely take us away from the theory of knowledge, because after all, the theory of knowledge is concerned with what reason we have to suppose that certain statements, propositions, are true or false. So I think that there has been a shift of emphasis, but not the great break that Dummett insists on.
Before we continue with the more recent applications of Frege's work, I want to turn to Russell for a moment. When I introduced this discussion, I emphasized the fact that Frege worked in isolation throughout almost the whole of his life. And this becomes very important when one starts to consider Russell, because poor Russell spent the first several years of his life reinventing work that Frege had already done without realizing that he'd done it, didn't he? Kat, so that should make it rather easy for you to explain to us something about the importance of Russell's very early work.
Well, I don't quite know why you say poor Russell, because it is quite true that Russell did a lot of work that Frege had done before him, but Russell also exposed a fatal deficiency in Frege's system. He showed that Frege's system of logic actually contained a paradox. It's like the famous old contradiction of Epimenides the Cretan, who said that all Cretans were liars. It follows comes into the category of self-defeating propositions.
And although on the surface it seems to be trivial, it's not trivial.
It's
because
not trivial.
It shows that the underlying argumentation has something wrong with it.
It does. It shows that one of Frege's essential assumptions led to contradiction.
Yeah.
And Russell in 1903, conveyed this in a letter to Frege, and Frege's first reaction was not, "Oh, I'm wrong." He was sufficiently arrogant to reply, "The whole of mathematics has been shown to be worthless." Then he thought this was going too far, and he then managed to put together some sort of answer to Russell's objection, but then it was shown only after Frege's death, in fact, by a Polish edition, that Frege's answer also was untenable, led to contradiction. And Frege himself never recovered from this blow. After he received, after the publication of the Begriffsschrift, the Grundgesetze, you yourself said earlier, he never wrote the third volume, and he simply gave up. From 1903 to 1925, his death, he never did anything, and this was the result.
He thought his life's work had been
demolished.
demolished.
Had been demolished,
yes.
So that, in fact, it's a very sad story.
Yes, a tragic story.
And a tragic story. And Russell then went on to meet this paradox in his own way, some complicated thing called the theory of types.
But it remains true, I ought to press this point, that an enormous amount of the work that Russell had done and spent years over, Frege had already done, and Russell didn't know.
Yes, that is true.
But it's also true that although Frege did it first, and some experts today think that Frege did most of it better, it was through Russell that the ideas actually became famous in philosophy and influential in philosophy.
That is true. I don't know why it was that Frege's work was so neglected, partly because, for an absurd reason, that interest in the new developments of logic was very much an English thing. So therefore, Frege's work wasn't taken up in Germany, because in Germany the mistaken psychological view of logic still prevailed, and wasn't taken up in England simply because of English insularity and incompetence in foreign languages. Yeah. And it was left.
But Russell, who'd been brought up by German governesses and German nurses, did know German.
Did know German. But even Russell only got it indirectly. What happened was that Russell and his collaborator Whitehead went to a congress in Paris in 1903 and met an Italian logician called Peano. And it was through Peano, whose work enormously impressed them, and who was working in the same direction, though with a less efficient system than Frege's, that they got to hear of Frege. Yeah. And then Russell read Frege and at once realized how important that it was.
And the result of all this was that the science of logic, which had remained virtually static for over 2,000 years since Aristotle, suddenly exploded into a whole new and enormous development.
Mainly through Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, which it took them together about 10 years to write. Well, Russell wrote the Principles of Mathematics in 1903, where he does make acknowledgement to Frege, I think, in the preface and in the appendix.
Yes, he does, yes.
And then he went on with his tutor at Trinity Cambridge, Whitehead, to write a 3-volume work called Principia Mathematica, in which he actually tried to do the work of deducing mathematics from logic, and it's full of formulae, and it is a stupendous work, although, as you rightly said, it doesn't quite achieve the standards of logical rigor that Frege had achieved before it. But this was the one that really popularized the subject. Then all sorts of people took it up, and it took, from then on, it has proceeded by leaps and bounds.
And it's now, so to speak, a major field of intellectual endeavour throughout the Western world, in every university.
But it's interesting, I think also should be mentioned, that one of the effects has been not so much to subdue mathematics to logic, which is what Frege and Russell wanted, but to subdue logic to mathematics. Yeah. And that in recent years, mathematical logic has become more and more mathematical, and has had less and less to do with philosophy in general. And even a disciple of Frege, like Michael Dummett, is more interested in the semantic side of it, the theory of meaning, than he has hitherto shown himself to be in the purely mathematical side.
Well, unlike Frege, Russell actually made the explicit step after he'd done all this work to general philosophy,
Yes.
didn't he? Not until he was 40 years old, but then he did. And he started producing general works of philosophy. Can you give us some indication of what position
Well,
he
it's very odd
took up?
how little the two are connected. They, the one place where I suppose they are connected is something that Russell called the theory of descriptions. There was a puzzle about the meaning of statements like the present King of France, which didn't denote anything.
What if you say the present King of France is bald?
Exactly.
There is no King of France.
Yeah, and therefore didn't know anything, and therefore there was a question how it could be meaningful. And there had been philosophers. A notable example is a German called Meinong, who then thought that these things denoted what he called subsistent entities, and Russell thought this was rubbish, and he showed a way of translating out such expressions by showing that they in fact contained covert existence claims. That King France is bald, which translated into there is one thing that now rules over France, and whatever it is that rules over France is bald, roughly. And this got rid of the apparent paradox. And so in that way, his logical work had a philosophical implication. But in the main, he simply went off on another tack. His first purely philosophical book came out in 1912. It's called The Problems of Philosophy. It's a Home University Library book. And in my view, still the best introduction to philosophy that there is, because Russell was such a marvelous writer, though it's a little bit old-fashioned. And there, he really takes no account of his logical work at all. He simply continues the British empiricist tradition. This is a book that follows straight on from Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and it starts off with the theory of perception. It's very like Berkeley there. It says that what we perceive are not tables and chairs and things, but what Locke called simple ideas, what Russell, following his friend Moore, called sense data, and then deals with the old traditional philosophical question, how on the basis of being presented with these sense impressions do we arrive at physical objects? And then he deals with a set of traditional philosophical problems in that sort of way. And he more or less gave up logic after Principia Mathematica. He himself said that this wore him out. He collaborated on the book with Whitehead, but Whitehead was teaching mathematics at Cambridge and mainly occupied with that. Russell at that time was living independently. Well, he had a lectureship at Cambridge from 1910 to 1915, but in the first decade of this century he was living on his independent income, and so he had the actual work of writing out all these proofs. And he said that this really incapacitated him for ever doing any detailed work in future. And this is to some extent true. All his later work is full of brilliant ideas that he never fully works out. At a certain point he gets bored. He says, oh yes, it goes on like this. He doesn't bother to dot the I's and cross the T's. And this is true of all his later work.
I think that I see one very important continuing concern in the later work. I'd be interested to know if you agree with this or not. You've just said, I'm sure rightly, that Russell was a radical empiricist in the direct tradition of Locke and Hume.
Certainly.
It seems to me that Russell was always concerned to validate the natural sciences in terms of sense data, that he always wanted to show that the whole corpus of our scientific knowledge could be derived from, and was derived from, nothing but observations and our reflections on our observations.
Well, not always. I think you make one very important point here, and one, in fact, that I overlooked when I was talking a few moments ago, and that is that from the very beginning, Russell's approach to philosophy was an interest in justification. There's quite an amusing story that when he was about 12, his elder brother, who was sent to school, Russell was taught at home, the elder brother Frank was sent to school, taught Russell geometry, and Russell refused to accept the axioms. He wanted to have them proved, and his brother said that they couldn't get on unless Russell accepted the axioms, so he agreed to provisionally. But he always wanted to have everything justified. And this was common both in his approach to logic and mathematics and in his approach to other branches of knowledge, and as you say, also in his approach to science. He wanted to have a basis for our belief in science. But here his views varied. In the book I mentioned, Problems of Philosophy, it's quite true that he wanted to start with sense data, but he didn't think that all scientific or even all common sense statements like that at the table, could be reduced to sensory statements. He adopted a causal theory that you could assume the existence of the physical world as the best explanation for our sensory experiences. Then he changed his view, and in the next important book that he published on the theory of knowledge, which was Our Knowledge of the External World, which came out in 1914, he did take the view you just referred to, namely he thought you could actually reduce not only every common sense statement, but every scientific statement to statements about our actual and possible hypothetical sense experiences. And this view, which is technically known as phenomenalism, and was the view of Berkeley, if you rob Berkeley of God, and also the view of John Stuart Mill, who was incidentally Russell's godfather, lay godfather, because Russell's parents and Dr. Mill didn't believe in God, but he's lay godfather. This phenomenalistic view was developed in Our Knowledge of the External World, and also in some important essays that Russell wrote in a book called Mysticism and Logic, which he produced during the First World War, an essay called something like Sense Data and Physics is the most important one there. And he continued this in another important book called The Analysis of Mind, which came out, I think, in 1921, and he adopted a theory which had been advanced before him by the pragmatist William James, Henry James's elder brother, in which both mind and matter were composed of what James called neutral stuff, and which were in fact sense data and images, and they differed only in being different arrangements of this fundamental data. But then Russell gave this up, and in 1925, well, 1925 is a curious book, Analysis of Matter, where there are traces of this view still remaining, but he mainly went back to the causal theory that he'd held in 1912. And when he revived his interest in philosophy in the 1940s, and in his final, or his next to last, philosophical book, Human Knowledge, Its Scope and Limits, he goes back to a causal theory. He always thought that the basis of our knowledge lay in sense experience, but he varied in the next step. I mean, it was only during one period of his work that he thought that the whole thing could be reduced to sensory terms. More often, and certainly at the end of his life very vehemently, he adhered to the causal theory, which put the physical world beyond the veil of observation.
One thing that is constant with Russell is the attempt to bring a wholly new rigour to bear in philosophy, not only of a logical kind, but one's tempted to say of a scientific kind. He was always very concerned, for example, that our beliefs should relate to the evidence for them. This is something he reiterated over and over again, isn't it? And it's something which, if taken seriously, sweeps aside a great deal of traditional philosophizing and traditional thinking.
Oh yes, that I think is true. And I think that this, you already mentioned that Russell had influence on Wittgenstein, and indeed Wittgenstein was Russell's pupil. And as you know, Wittgenstein and also that group of philosophers in Vienna called the Vienna Circle condemned what they call metaphysics. And metaphysics, in their view, consisted, at least partly, in any attempt to describe the world in non-scientific terms. They thought that this was the only world there is, and that science was a matter of forming theories about it, which were verified by observation, and any assumption that there was a superior world, a world inhabited by gods or anything of that sort, was nonsensical. And Russell certainly all the time held this, and was always concerned to justify science, and was always worried by the fact he thought the justification for science was extremely problematic.
Yes,
I mean,
and it remained problematic to the end.
To the end, I mean, and it's very interesting, in the last book that he wrote, Human Knowledge, the one I referred to, he then sets out what he thinks are the set of assumptions that require to be made if belief in scientific theories is to be justified, and makes it quite clear. Do you think these assumptions must, as it were, be taken on faith?
Yes.
And he tried to work out what we call a theory of induction, but was never entirely satisfied with it, and more or less said, well, I remember what he said. He said that we really can't be sure that science is true, but it has a greater chance of being true than anything else that can be set up as its rival.
Yes, though he still couldn't validate it in the way he would
couldn't
have
validate it in the way he would like to,
No,
to have done.
Let's just talk now in an orderly way about the influence of Russell, because he and Wittgenstein, I suppose, must be the two most influential philosophers
Yes.
in the 20th century, at least in the English-speaking world. Now, I suppose Russell's first great influence was on his immediate contemporaries, and indeed older contemporaries like Whitehead and Moore in the Cambridge of his young day.
Let us put it this way. In the purely logical work in which Russell and Whitehead collaborated, it was, I think, Russell who had the more interesting ideas. I mean, I think the theory of types, the theory of descriptions came from Russell. But when it came to trying to apply that sort of technique to philosophy, which to a certain extent Russell did in Our Knowledge of the External World, for example, in trying to reduce abstract concepts like concepts of points and instants to observational terms, then it was Whitehead who took the lead, and Russell got his ideas from Whitehead, and indeed they quarrelled over this because Russell didn't pay Whitehead sufficient acknowledgement. You'll find the theory developed in two books of Whitehead that came out after the war, The Principles of Natural Knowledge and the Concept of Nature. And Russell at one time was influenced by MacTaggart, who was a disciple of Hegel, and got Russell to be, both Russell and Moore, to be idealists. And Moore, first of all, rebelled against this in the interest of common sense. Moore was a great defender of common sense, and influenced Russell to the extent that he cured Russell of any belief in idealism. So their influence went that way. Also, with respect to ethics, in which Russell was never greatly interested, he accepted, like all Bloomsbury, he accepted Moore's Principia Mathematica. He believed that good was a non-natural, indefinable concept, and so on. But then Russell had a very big influence on the later, or my generation of philosophers, inasmuch as he convinced us that since science was sovereign in the description of the world, all that philosophy could do was elucidate and analyze. And so Russell can be regarded, I think, as the father of analysis. But here he differs profoundly from Wittgenstein. I don't want to go too deeply into Wittgenstein, but...
Well, I'd rather you didn't, because we're going to devote the whole of the next programme to Wittgenstein.
But one thing that will come out in our next programme is that Wittgenstein thought that philosophy was largely a matter of people getting into a muddle, and that the business of people like Wittgenstein was to, as in his own famous phrase, show the fly the way out of the fly bottle, to cure people of these muddles. Whereas Russell always thought that philosophical problems had a solution. And that was why he was so very hostile to the purely linguistic philosophy that developed, for example, at Oxford after the war under the leadership of Austin, because he thought this the mere exploration of language for its own sake, the exploration of the implications of English usage, was trivial. And Russell really thought that there were questions about justification of our beliefs that it was the business of philosophy to answer, and that these questions were answerable. He thought that the answers could be discovered if you worked at it hard enough. Otherwise, he didn't think philosophy was worth doing. And here I agree with him.
Yes, I was going to say, I want to put a personal question to you, because all your life you have acknowledged that you yourself have been enormously influenced by Russell, and you make that very clear, and always have. So you can tell us what it's like from the inside, as it were, to have been influenced by Russell. What has its influence been on you?
On me, it's been, first of all, that unlike most of my contemporaries, I still think one should start with what Russell called sense data, what I now prefer to call sense qualia. That is a technical difference, whether you begin with particulars or something more general. But for our present purposes, it comes to the same thing. So that on the whole, I share his... certainly the starting point of his views on perception. I also agree with the importance, the primacy he attaches to the theory of knowledge. I am, and I've always been, a thoroughgoing empiricist. I agree with the view that Russell derived from Hume, that there's no necessity other than logical necessity, so that there's no such thing as causal necessity. Causal is just a matter what Hume originally said it was, namely constant conjunction and something purely contingent. I agree with Russell in rejecting any form of theology, or anyhow transcendent theology, and in rejecting metaphysics. And I also, and most importantly, agree with Russell that philosophy wouldn't be worth doing unless it posed questions to which we could find the answers. Perhaps not he, perhaps not I, but cleverer persons than I will eventually find the answers.
And all these are examples not just of your agreeing with him, but of him having influenced
Oh,
you,
yes.
are they? All of them, quite
Yes.
directly.
Yes, quite directly, quite directly.
And I think you've even been influenced by him in the way you write, haven't you? That appears
Well,
to
I
me
do
to be the
regard him as a
case.
master of English prose, and well, I think I'm not in the same class as Russell as a philosopher, but I do think that I do write English reasonably well, and I do think...
And again, partly under his influence.
And again, partly under his influence, yes. I think
yes,
there is affiliation there, both of ideas and of style, from Hume through Mill to Russell and coming down a stage to me.
Yes. Now, the philosophers that we're discussing here, Frege and Russell, have enormous effect on the living, yourself included. And I now want to talk about the revival of interest in Frege after the Second World War, so that the interest in Frege and the interest in Russell, for the first time, proceed side by side into the age that, that we now live in.
It's very difficult to account for historical events, particularly in such short perspective.
Yeah.
And I think there certainly was, immediately after the war, a decline in Russell's influence, anyhow, in England. And this was, I think, not due to a revival of interest in Frege, but to an increased importance attached to the work of Wittgenstein and Moore. In Moore's case, though I enormously liked and respected him as a man, I think philosophically it was excessive. And I think this was two people responsible for this were partly not so much Ryle, who respected Russell, but mainly Austin, who was the linguistic philosopher in the narrowest possible sense, and had a great respect for Moore as someone who attached great importance to ordering English usage and to common sense and so on. Common sense was said by Russell, incidentally, to be the metaphysics of savages.
Yes,
and
yes.
I think it was the upgrading of Moore that was responsible for at that time for the downgrading of Russell. And this is a trend that's now been reversed, I'm glad to say.
I think you go a bit too far in saying Russell was downgraded, because if one thinks back to those post-war years and thinks now who were the major philosophers in the English-speaking world, the shortest of short lists would have to include, apart from Russell himself, Wittgenstein, Karl Popper, Quine, Gilbert Ryle, yourself, and all of you were massively influenced by Russell.
Yes. Perhaps yes, so you would know better than I, because you, after all, were up at Oxford in the 50s when I had already departed for London. But certainly the impression reaching us in London was that Russell was being undervalued. And I
that
remember
means you're taking an Oxford-based view, and I think that's what's mistaken about the view.
That's possibly
I think
true,
there were
yes.
other people around then who
Yes.
disparaged Russell. It's
Yes.
perfectly true.
Yes.
But their work and their influence hasn't lasted.
I'm very glad to hear this.
Yeah.
And certainly Russell has recovered.
Yes.
He himself,
Yes.
perhaps I'm influenced by the fact that he himself thought this.
Yes.
Because I was seeing a great deal of him at the time. I organised a little group in London that he attended, and he was certainly, miffed is perhaps too mild a word, but he thought that he wasn't getting his due. And all philosophers are slightly vain, and this certainly caused him pain.
But we agree in any case that he's come back.
He's come back, certainly.
Yes.
Now, the revival of Frege is something that I really, I think can't explain. I don't even know exactly how it happened. Probably it started in America with the development of a school of logicians led by a man called Alonzo Church, who insisted on very great rigor in logical mathematics and found it in Frege and didn't find it in Russell and Whitehead, though of course they did find it elsewhere. They found it, for example, in Hilbert, though they disagree with Hilbert for other reasons. And in England, it seems to have been the first evidence I can find of it is in a book published fairly late, about 1960, I think, by William and Martha Neal, which is a very impressive history of logic, in which very great importance is given to Frege. He's put on a level with Aristotle. These are the two great names. And
You've jumped over one thing.
I've jumped over one thing.
Yes.
You suddenly
Yes.
remind me there was a translation in the early 50s.
1950 itself.
1950 itself, was
Yep,
it?
yep.
Made by Austin
Yes.
of Frege's Grundlagen, wasn't
Yes,
it?
yes.
And then there was also a translation made 2 or 3 years later by Max Black, an Englishman working in America, and by Peter Geach, of two of Frege's very obscure but important semantic essays, one of them called Sense and Reference and the other called Function and Concept. And so there was in the early 50s this sudden interest in Frege, but I'm not quite certain what led to it, or indeed what consequences it had.
Well, a lot of very bright younger people took it up, didn't they, and were influenced by it. Whether that'll last or not, I don't know, but it certainly seems to me to have been going on recently.
I find very little influence of Frege in current philosophical work, apart from the work of Dummett. If you look at, for example, I think now perhaps some of the most interesting work being done is being done in America, and if you look at the work of people like Quine and Putnam and Thomas Nagel and Donald Davidson in particular, you don't find so strong an influence of Frege, except perhaps in Davidson's case indirectly through the work of the Polish tradition Tarski on truth, which in a sense links up with Frege as much as Frege linked meaning and truth.
Are you confident that the influence of Russell will last?
Yes.
You are. Why? Why so?
Because I think because that is the view I take of philosophy. I think that the questions he asked are the important philosophical questions, and I think that his answers to them, whether right or wrong, will always need to be taken into consideration.
And if I'm right about you too, you also think that his approach, his conception of what philosophy is the right conception.
Yes.
That it consists of clarification, therefore analysis, and justification, therefore argument, of our important beliefs.
Written in straightforward English prose. Oh, well, not necessarily English, but written in...
In straightforward prose.
in straightforward prose.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Ayer.
Not at all.